Nick Bradley, so glad to sit down and get some time.
Brad, it is awesome to be here, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, man. So give me a little background. I know the bullets, but give me a little background on how you got into business in the first place. Then we'll fast forward to today.
That's a story. That's a story. We can go back a while. So I actually started my first business when I was 18, and I'm 48 now, so we are going back a long time. And this was sort of in the 90s in Adelaide, South Australia. And Adelaide, South Australia is this like sleepy little town, sort of stuck between Perth and the East Coast, right? So everyone either goes to Sydney or Melbourne, or they go to Perth. Adelaide's not much going on. What it does have going for it, though, is there are a lot of professional services there. So you've got doctors, you've got stockbrokers, you've got lawyers and things like that. And when I was 18, I started a personal training business, so a fitness business. And what I was teaching back then was effectively what we would call functional training now, or CrossFit, that type of stuff, but before any of that was popular. And of course, now most people have the ability to have a personal trainer. But back then, in the sort of early 90s, this was a whole new trend. So I had this business that I started. It grew pretty quickly. I ended up having about 4 or 5 employees within the first 12 months of starting that business. And I ended up selling it. This is my first exit when I go back. I sold it for 3,000 Australian dollars.
Wow.
Which might buy you a Starbucks coffee or something these days. But you know, it's funny, like a lot of things happen. So my family were not entrepreneurial, or certainly my immediate family at that time. And everyone said to me, listen, why are you doing this thing? Why are you starting this business? Go and get a job. You know, getting a job is safe. So I had this kind of weird sort of moment where I thought, well, what am I going to do? I can't really stay in this environment anymore. The personal training business could have grown and scaled. I had this conflicting thing going on with what my immediate environment was saying. So I sold the company and I went to Sydney, and I got connected with Rupert Murdoch's nephew, a guy called Matt Hambury. Now, again, as I said, when you're a personal trainer, you have high net worth people coming to train with you. So doctors, lawyers, stockbrokers. And the connection to Matt Hambury was via one of my clients. So I turned up and had a conversation with Matt. Didn't know much about what was going on. I knew he was in magazines and publishings and newspapers and things like that. And I ended up impressing him for whatever reason. And I got the job as marketing manager of Men's Health magazine in Sydney, Australia, within about 3 days of being there, right? So I sold my company, had a little bit of cash, got this amazing job. First job, really.
Bizarre. And why? How did you get a marketing manager position coming from being a personal trainer?
So it was Men's Health for starters, right? So there was the fitness background, but there is a story to this. So I turned up and I met Matt, and Matt, you know, like you would imagine the Murdoch family is, like they're kind of all over the place, visionary, like, you know, big thinking. So I only had like 5-10 minutes with him, but he then had me meet his marketing director at the time, a lady called Sandra. And she was like, listen, you know, there's all these people who are really qualified, you know, you've come via Matt, so we'll give you a chance. We're going to be making a selection this week. Come back for an interview. So what I did is I went home that night and I literally wrote a marketing plan. Now I had studied marketing at university, but I hadn't done it before and things like that. So I had a little bit of background, but I remember staying up all night. So at 4 o'clock in the morning the next day, I submitted this sort of 30 or 40 page document which had brand strategy and all these other bits and pieces. And at 11 o'clock that morning, they called me and said, you got the job.
Wow.
I know. It was one of those things where I learned that, do you know what, if you go all in, like, you know, I said, I'm going to get this job. I'm going to get this job. And I worked for hours and hours that day and night to get it, and then got the outcome.
That's awesome. Yeah, to date, I know, I just had a conversation with somebody here where their strategy in general is they've got an in-house media team, and they will go take other people's content and chop it up and make these amazing videos, deliverables for free. And that's the introduction. That's how they get it. That's how they get attention of the people that they're trying to court.
Yeah, and this was 1994 or something, 95 when I did this. And you know what I said to myself though was, I'm going to do everything I can with the opportunity that was presented to me in this moment to get it, so that if I didn't get it, I knew that I couldn't do anything else. That was my mindset. I still remember that. And that strategy, if you like, I've used multiple times since when the same thing has been presented. You know, I've got this opportunity, I've got a limited amount of time. What can I do within this window to make sure that I'm not going to feel like I let myself down? So yeah, that was the first learning. But yeah, I mean, I spent years within media. So I ended up working for News International, reported into Lachlan Murdoch, so Rupert Murdoch's son for a while, got involved in corporate strategy and bits and pieces. And then I went to work for one of the biggest competitors to News International, a business called EMAP, which stands for East Midlands Allied Press, a UK business, but they had a subsidiary in Sydney. And I worked there for a number of years on magazines like FHM. I don't know if you've ever heard of FHM. It's for Him magazine. It's like we called it a lads mag. I'm trying to put this gently. It's not quite Playboy,
Right.
but it was crazy levels of stuff.
It's like Maxim, right?
Exactly the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there was a few of them around at the time, and FHM was the UK version of that.
Yes.
In the UK, it sold over 1 million copies a month. Wow. It was a behemoth of a brand. Even in Australia, which was a smaller market, we were doing 250,000 to 300,000 copies a month, and I was heading up marketing for that. And I was also heading up marketing for Empire magazine, which was a movie magazine, and all these other sports titles. And that was just a crazy time. And we were doing things like, I suppose you would call it guerrilla marketing these days, but back then it was just trying to do stunts, PR stunts. And on a Friday afternoon, I did a partnership with one of the big radio stations in Sydney, and we had this thing called the FHM Shout, which we would basically name a pub somewhere in Sydney. We call it out at 4 o'clock and we say, listen, everyone turn up to this pub. We'll be there. We'll put some money behind the bar. We'll have all these promotional girls there and whatever else. And so I literally used to have to turn up to these places with $10,000 in my back pocket of cash.
Whoa.
And we'd just turn up to like the Coogee Bay Hotel. All these people would just go there straight away. We'd get obviously the hotel lined up beforehand. And we took the brand from number 3 in the market to number 1 in about 9 months, just by doing stuff that was hard to replicate. It wasn't traditional marketing or anything like that. And then that was so successful for EMAP that they then invited me to come to the UK, seconded me over to then be the brand director across all the car and motorcycle magazines for the group. And that was a massive role. It was supposed to be for 9 months as a secondment initially. I ended up staying there. I've now been there 20 years in the UK. And lots of stuff's happened after that. But I'll pause there because that's my foray into business before obviously what I do now.
Yeah, wild ride.
Yeah, it was good fun.
I do love the committing and going all in to get the job in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that approach in life. So you had the personal training thing, and I know that, the gap that we're bridging ultimately is you spent a bunch of time in private equity.
Yeah.
And a bunch of time helping companies exit. And that's right. Sort of a big chunk of your world now as a result. Did you run a company before you got into private equity? Was it always working for larger institutional companies before you did that?
It was always institutional. So I ended up going from marketing into corporate strategy. And it's interesting now because I talk about this quite a lot. If you want to grow and scale a business quickly, the 2 things you've got to dial in is obviously fantastic marketing and the ability to do joint ventures and acquisitions. And if you can do those things within a certain frame of time, that's what we do in private equity, dial those 2. We call them acquisition strategies generally because you're bringing in revenue and profit from those different plays. That's how you scale. So marketing to acquisitions wasn't that much of a leap because you've still got to go out there and look at the market, look at kind of different things. It's a very strategic approach. So I went to do a heap of acquisitions with EMAP. Then I went to Getty Images after that and did something like 47 acquisitions while I was there because that business was all based around acquisition at the time. Then I went into private equity and basically worked on over 100 portfolio companies. Going in, I was the CEO multiple times, like interim CEO, doing turnarounds, scale-ups, everything that you can possibly imagine. But my whole remit was to be able to take a business from a position where it was either doing well but needed to accelerate, or it had been invested in, it was failing, which is equally as bad. It was underwater from an investment standpoint, and my job was to get it back to baseline and then obviously accelerate that growth after that.
So you did a bunch of acquisitions as sort of an in-house person doing acquisitions. That was the strategy role. Right. Got it. And when you were doing that for larger companies, were you sitting in as CEO then? Were you a part of the sort of integration process then, or was it not until you got into PE?
Yeah, I went up to relatively senior levels within the media business. So I was running divisions. within those companies. And for context, EMAP at the time was the second biggest consumer publisher in the UK and was a FTSE 100 company. So it was a publicly listed, publicly traded behemoth and doing crazy money. In fact, I was involved in the exit of that business in 2008. It got broken up into private equity, and this was kind of my first step into private equity. And that was a 10-figure exit. That was just under $2.1 billion. And so I was involved in the positioning to some extent. When it's a big business like that, you just get involved in management presentations and part of the exit strategy. But it did teach me a lot of the stuff that I do now came from that experience because there was so much money at stake and so many different egos at stake and everything else. So I did that. So I was senior management there. Then I went to Getty Images, a similar sort of thing. And then after we exited Getty, and that was another 10-figure exit, I've done 3 in total. Then I started to work more with the private equity firms, going in as a CEO or an operating partner. And we can define what those two things are. But effectively, it's the person who is not just managing the spreadsheets. You're managing the people, you're managing the process, you're looking at the business strategy. So effectively, I've been a CEO now, I think 7 times officially. But I've been involved in board and advisory and all that sort of stuff around that for over a decade.
Can you give me an idea of, for context, the size of the companies that you've sat as a CEO for?
Yeah, so I have, in terms of revenue, the biggest that I've sat on is just over $100 million. The average, if you went through that, would be, they're all 8 figures, every single one of them. Everything ranging from around $15 to $20 million all the way up to about $50 million.
And what about team size?
Biggest team that I've had is 480.
And what's the smallest?
Smallest, digital business, about 15.
Yeah, awesome.
So the range is interesting. But one thing I will say is that having now done a lot of research in this space, I found that there's 2 types of entrepreneurs. There might be more, but certainly in my frame, there's 2. You've got the ones that are great at starting a company, and they normally get it to a certain level, and then they struggle to take it to the next level for lots of reasons we can talk about. And then you get people who are good at picking up the creativity and the foundations of someone like that and then taking the business on. And I was definitely that person. So I wasn't, even though I started a business when I was younger, I don't think my superpower is starting. It's taking the foundations and then elevating and expanding them to the next level.
Yeah. Well, I really like understanding the context of headcount in particular, because obviously the role of a CEO at 400 people is slightly different.
Very different.
Than at 15 people, right?
Yeah.
But it's a fascinating story to me because, and there's critiques around PE for this routinely, where they put money in and then they send somebody in to operate the business. And the entrepreneur that was previously running it or is running it is like, the fuck is this clown doing coming in trying to run the business, right? How do they think that they're going to be able to run the business? And very often you see PE fuck that up.
Oh yeah.
I mean, routinely, just in the last 3 days, I've had 2 different friends that I found out they sold their companies in the last 2 years. And then PE came back to him and said, hey, so can you buy this back?
Yeah, it happens a lot. And the reason for it, and one of the things I've done over the last, I think 3 years is try to demystify private equity a little bit. So on my podcast, I've been talking a lot about, this is what you need to know as a business owner or a founder, but also these are some of the things that they don't get right versus the things they do get right. And it's changed a lot now, but what I would say is that there was too much emphasis put on the financials. So you look at the profits, the EBITDA as we call it, you look at the revenue, you look at other metrics in the business, and you think that's a great business, right?
And I'm sorry, so you mean that there has historically with private equity companies been too much emphasis on financials?
When they assess the company.
Got it.
So to the point of you saying about, a couple of founders get the opportunity to buy their company back, it happens more than you'd like to know. And the reason for that is the assessment on the acquisition has been done financially, but it hasn't been done operationally or culturally. So therefore, the things that actually make the business work, people, process, culture to bring that in, values, how things get done around here, those things are not assessed well enough. And of course, if the founder has been the cog of all of that, and then they're not incentivized or they're pissed off or whatever it ends up being, then all of that thing falls down and the business goes backwards. So I would be sent in. The reason I know this intimately is I would be sent in after that had happened quite often. And Nick, can you just go in there and just get this thing back on track? And so I would have to go in there with a playbook to be able to do that.
Yeah, I love this. This is great. And obviously, PE works very, very well, very often also.
Well, yeah. I mean, to your point, just to make this known, that because I asked this question a few times actually about where is the sense in firing the CEO, the founder? Where does that make sense? Because, you know, there's high risk to that. And a couple of the bigger private equity firms that I've worked with, the most successful ones, say, yeah, on the face value, it looks like that. But if you look at the numbers and if you look at the research, there's more success from changing out a founder to a scale-up CEO, right? There's more success in that strategy than there is the risk of the business going backwards. Even though it may look like a dip first before you get the growth. So yeah, but I suppose logically or emotionally maybe kind of feels weird.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
amazing.
I think emotionally, yes.
Yeah.
Right. So you were high up C-level running divisions. When you moved over to private equity, what made you feel comfortable stepping in as CEO? The first one that you stepped in to run, were you confident in your ability to do that? Or did you step in and think, shit, I don't know. Let's see how this goes.
It wasn't, what's the saying? It wasn't my first rodeo. I had good, I suppose, training both at EMAP and Getty. And by the training, I mean training in the job by mentors and things like that existed in those companies. And also sort of formal training, like they would send us away to business schools and all sorts of different things. So we had the theory, we had a fair amount of the practice, and you had to have that because I was running these large divisions with a lot of pressure and accountability on the numbers. So when I went to private equity, I was first effectively what is called an operating partner. Now, an operating partner is the person who sits on the board. So every time you sell a company, and often it happens when you get venture capital funding as well, in order to protect that investment, a board will be created. And a lot of visionary founders hate that because for the first time, they've got a boss, right? They've got this thing, you know, people sitting around in some form of governance or entity telling you what you need to do or asking stupid questions, right? But that's how it works. And I'll get into that in a bit later. So I would be on those boards as an operating partner. Now, the operating partner is kind of like the CEO that's not the CEO, right? So it's the person who sits on the board who has run big P&Ls before, has managed big teams, has had to hire and fire, build culture. But you're effectively there to mentor the founder or the CEO in the business that you're representing, but also ask the questions that probably are the challenging questions. So to your point, like when I was injected in to be the CEO, which didn't happen all the time, but it would happen when things weren't working, I was always coming from a place where I had a relative knowledge of the strategy of the business and what was going on from those board conversations. The bit that I didn't know very well was what's actually in the business. So when you walk in the door and you have to sense the culture and you have to see what's going on, that's the bit that was a bit intimidating at times. And there's a funny movie, it's called Up in the Air with George Clooney. Where he flies around and sort of sacks people and does all this sort of stuff. And I sort of think back to my my stint when I was at Getty. I was literally on planes all the time, going into companies, having to walk in the door. People knew kind of what I was there to do. And it was weird. Like, you know, it's like selling your soul a little bit. But once you got into it, you'd have to find the people who bought into the vision of the company, who still wanted to be there. You'd have to restructure around those people, right? And quite often, you wouldn't have to make too many changes to leadership or management because you'll always find some good people in those organizations who want to keep doing what the company was doing. Other times, if there's a lot of loyalty to the founder, you know, the people who've been there for the whole ride, you'd have to change them out because they just couldn't get back to emotion. They couldn't get away from the fact that there was so much change. And that was then distracting their ability to be able to drive the next phase of growth in the company.
Sure. Yeah. How big was the first company that you effectively came and sat in? How many people were you?
That was one of the smaller ones. That was around about $20 million of revenue, making around about 7 million profit. So it was what we call mid-market private equity. And that business had, I'm trying to think back now, it was a while, about 150 people. It was a service-based business. So still quite a lot.
Right?
Yeah. But in different types of private equity, mid-market private equity, normally check sizes, which are normally around $50 to $250 million. But this was a smaller entity that they were trying out, and they wanted me to go in there and fix it up. And I left that business. We almost doubled it. Not quite. But yeah, and that was about 3 years, just by changing what they were doing.
Mm. Yeah, it's fascinating. The whole thing is, and we were talking before we turned the cameras on, effectively, maybe, possibly.
Yeah, that's right.
About today, you sort of teaching these things to entrepreneurs to think about that world. And I want to get to kind of today and what you do and how you go through some of that stuff. Why did you leave private equity?
Yeah, so this is all right. So
and give me the stats too, because you've got some fun numbers around what you did while you were in private equity.
Yeah, I'll start with that. In the course of, I suppose, my professional career, which bridges both corporate and private equity, it's 117 acquisitions. And that's not like, that sounds like a big number maybe to a lot of people, but I know people have done double that amount when they've been just in private equity the whole time, buying businesses. I suppose my experience is slightly different because I would ultimately go into some of those companies as opposed to just do the transactions. So I was going deeper than what a lot of people do. And I've been involved in totality with 26 exits now, and 3 of those have been 10 figures. The last one, which actually was the catalyst for leaving private equity, was a business we sold in 2017, 2018 for $2.3 billion. And that was an education technology company that was sold to Blackstone. And interestingly, with that one, I was the CEO of the international division of that company before the exit because it was owned by another private equity firm. And I was brought in to manage the international integration. But that was a massive exit. I mean, that was we sold it for 14 times profit. The expectation was going to be 10 times profit. And when you're dealing with those sort of numbers, that difference of 4 percentage points in the multiple is hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, right? So that was that's what I've done. But the reason I left, and it's interesting. So private equity, you're dealing with such big numbers, right? And there's particularly some of the stuff I was involved in, and you've got egos like you haven't seen, right? And when the numbers, like, a private equity partner might get a bonus of $100 million, right? When a deal gets done, right? Or something like that. So you've got lots of money and power at stake. And for a period of time, I was quite indoctrinated into that world because it's very intoxicating, right? The money's good, the power's good, all of these sort of things. But after a while, you start to see cracks and chinks. So even the richest people that I've hung out with, ultra high net worth people, a lot of the rest of their lives are falling apart, right? And the people that they are and how they're showing up, I thought, do I really want to be that sort of person? So that was the first thing, right? Second thing, when I was doing this deal, this last exit, there was so much power play between the people on the board. And I was supposed to walk out of that with a lot more money than I did. Made a bit of chunk of cash, but there was a massive fight I was having internally with another person trying to sort of attribute power within that deal. And that was starting to affect my health because I was based in the UK and they were based out in Boston. And they were closer to where everything was going on. And there was stuff being said and I wasn't involved. And I thought, God, this is really starting to stress me out now. I need to move over there. And I just had a daughter being born, my second daughter. All this was going on. But the real catalyst was this. I mentioned beforehand when I started my first company back in Adelaide, Australia, I didn't have any entrepreneurs around me. And the reason for that is that my dad left my family when I was 2 years of age. He left, marriage breakup, that sort of stuff. And there was a lot of instability when I was younger. So my mum was married multiple times. My father influence, if you like, was my grandfather. And he was the guy who was saying, listen, just get a job. Anyway, my father comes back into my life about 24 months before we closed that big deal.
Oh, wow.
So 30 something odd years.
And had never seen him talk to him?
Never.
Oh my God.
Now, lots of things go on here, right? So first and foremost, he's a very successful entrepreneur.
Oh, crazy.
So before he was 40, he was a millionaire. He had this set of jewelry shops in Melbourne, Australia. And he lost it all because there was a bombing, right, of the Turkish consulate in Collins Street, Melbourne. This was in the 80s, I think. And of course, you don't get insurance for terrorist attacks and stuff like that. So he lost it all. So in his 40s, he had to then build himself back up. He ended up being a sales director for a friend's chemical company. Had the opportunity within that to effectively distribute in Australia this environmentally friendly pesticide, because his friend didn't want to do it. So he said, I'll do it. And this was before environmental stuff was a big thing. And effectively became a millionaire again in his 50s. Right. So this is, and I didn't know any of this. I'm thinking, God, this is maybe where my entrepreneurial thing comes from. So anyway, within that couple of years of him coming back, we had this amazing trip where I was in Vermont running this ultra marathon, and he came out and crewed for me, and we went fishing and all this sort of stuff. Finished that trip in Cape Cod on the beach, said goodbye. My youngest daughter, my oldest daughter then was around, 5 or 6 years of age, all this sort of stuff. The next day I see him, 9 months later, was the day before he dies of cancer in hospital in Melbourne.
Oh my God.
All of this happened, and this is when the deal's getting closed. And around that time, I went to bed. I remember I was super stressed. All this was going on. I'm having all these conflicting emotions as well as everything else. And I literally broke the 2 right molars on the side of my jaw. I went to bed one night, clenched down so tight that I cracked these 2 teeth.
A strong jaw.
Yeah, I know. It doesn't happen very often. And I remember going to the bathroom, and this was like swollen. It was like, what the hell's going on? Went to the doctor first and then the dentist. And the dentist said, I've seen this before. It's high levels of stress. You're not well. You're not well. And I'm like, shit, I don't feel great, right? And I hadn't felt great anyway. So 2 weeks later, just by chance and speaking to a couple of friends, I ended up on a plane to Chicago, and I went to a Tony Robbins event. I went to Unleash the Power Within at the United Center in Chicago. And cried my eyes out for a few days, because there were a lot of things that, when you're in that world of private equity, you're taught to act and think and be like this, right? And it's the opposite of anything that's probably like I am now, right? And so at that event, sort of starting to learn a little bit more about who I am and what I can be, I made the decision to quit private equity. And I didn't quit straight away. I came back and did one last stint, because as you can appreciate, when you live in that world, you've got to balance the amount of money you're making in that world with, the 2 Porsches I had, the girls in private school, the massive house, right?
Sure.
Woe is Nick, right? but I made a decision that I'm going to change the trajectory and the paradigm, but I'm not going to let my family suffer, right? That was the thing. So I did one last stint. I got strategic, to use the term we spoke about beforehand. And I started my podcast as a way of getting my story out to the world, but also to be cathartic for me. It was almost like a therapy session for myself, because the first 30 episodes was me just talking into a microphone, right? Just telling the story. And it got a heap of traction. It went to #1 in the UK really quickly, and heaps of downloads. It was called Scale Up Your Business at the time. And the private equity firm that I was working for started to get really annoyed. I'm like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be this guy who we can control. And I was actually the CEO of a company that put me in to be the CEO. And all of my LinkedIn profile had nothing to do with that. It had the podcast and stuff, because I already made the decision. I was checked out. And I said to my wife, let's build a advisory consultancy business off the back of everything I've done. But instead of working for private equity firms, we're just going to work with founders. We're just going to work with the people like my dad that created all this value as entrepreneurs. And we're going to help them understand how, when they sell their company for life-changing money, freedom, impact, whatever that is, the value goes to them, not to the private equity firms, because there's a massive imbalance there. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it took about 10 months before I got called into the private equity boardroom, and they said, we want you to quit the podcast. And by then it had heaps of traction, and I had this kind of side hustle consultancy thing going on as well. And I already had the resignation letter in my bag. And I said to my wife, as soon as they call me and it's going to happen, I'm just going to put the letter on the desk. And I did. And that was it. And that was 2019. So a few years ago now. And that was the change.
Just in time for COVID.
Just in time for COVID. Yeah.
That probably was a fantastic thing to do just before COVID, because you had then alleviated the need to actively participate in this horrifically volatile, crazy economy where you were expected to manage by the numbers.
I just couldn't do it anymore. So it's one of those things like COVID, that actually was good for what we do now. I think also because it gave business owners time to reflect. I mean, obviously people there's lots of pivots and to use that term, but for me, I look very different. Like if you knew me 5 years ago, I was a lot heavier. I lost like 25 pounds. I was like just not a healthy guy. And as soon as I made that transition to, I suppose, live how I wanted to live and make a bigger impact, then everything changed with my psychology as well. So,
well, I mean, because I'm me, I have to dig into your little throwaway comment about running an ultra.
No.
So were you overweight running the ultras or the ultra, or was this after you had made a choice on health?
I've done 67 marathons and 24 ultras over the course of a decade. So
wow.
I ran, I think it was 2010. When I ran the London Marathon. And then I did Comrades, which is an awesome race over in South Africa. And that ultra marathon that my dad came to was the Vermont 100-mile race up there. I was in good shape running. I wouldn't say I was healthy. I mean, I'd run a marathon every Sunday just as a training run. I'd get up at 4 a.m. and run. And I look back now in hindsight and say I was running away from all the stuff that was going on because I knew probably subconsciously, it wasn't where I needed to be, but I hadn't sort of lined everything up. But then when everything started to sort of fall down, when my dad was sick over that year, because it took him 9 months to pass away, but over that period of time, I put on heaps of weight. And that was also when the deal was getting closed, late nights, no exercise. I stopped running altogether. And that's when I was not looking good.
Got it. What's the longest run you've done?
103 miles.
It
wasn't supposed to be that long, by the way. It was supposed to be 87.
How does that work?
It was supposed to be 87 miles, but I took a detour.
You got lost?
It's called the Wunner or the Honor. It's a race in the UK, which is along the Jurassic coastline. And you have to run out. You run on the coastline, it's up and down, but you also have to run out to this island. And I got lost on the island, ended up going somewhere else, coming back. So yeah, it was about 8 miles actually. I was out, something like that. Yeah.
I've done that on a bike before where I expected it to be a certain distance and then something happened and I ended up biking for like 3 extra hours.
It was like that. And
running's way worse to get lost though.
Well, there's also a point when you run like that, and it's good. It's a meditative thing for me as well. Like I still run these days, but it's like you get into a state where you lose time. And if you haven't eaten enough, you haven't got enough energy, you kind of get really clouded in your head. And so I remember just running, lost track of time. And my wife was texting me going, you realize, because she was tracking me, because you can track these races, you realize you're running totally the wrong direction. I'm like, what? This looks, it was dark as well, like you run through the night. And I'm like, what's going on? And then I realized I literally had gone to the other side of this island. I had to circle back. And then after that, I had to run, was it another 2 marathons or a marathon and a half? Something like that after that.
Did you have any, in those moments, in that situation, did you have, how did you handle it emotionally? Were you frustrated? Did you beat yourself up about it? Did you ruminate around how you were going to have extra distance on this already horrific long run? Or
that's a really, really good question in terms of, because I can answer that really clearly. I was incredibly gritty and focused. Didn't care. So I had a band on my arm that said, this is what you came for. So the fact it was hard or harder was like good.
Yeah.
But if I look back, I mean, I'm much more balanced now. I still do cool stuff, but I don't have the same psychology around that stuff. Back then, it was almost like training myself for the warfare that would happen in the boardroom table. And so if it was harder in that, then, as soon as I turned up and had to negotiate a big deal and stuff like that, it was fine. I mean, we talked before you pressed record that when I was in this event a couple of days ago, I was asked about this exit, the 2.3 billion one. And it was funny because they said, oh, what's the biggest one you've been involved in? I said, $2.3 billion. And everyone in the room was like, whoa, boom, right? And I just was deadpan, like, well, it's just a number. And that wasn't me now. That was me, 5-10 years ago, because that's how you are. But everyone was like, they couldn't fathom the number. But for me, it's just training, right? It's what I was used to.
Well, that is actually where I was going, was whether you saw great alignment, or you do today, between running, but specifically endurance running, and your business life, or if they're at odds at all. Like I know for me, if I'm going into endurance things, it necessarily for me distracts from the other things in my life because there's so much energy that goes into it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, both mental energy, but the physical, like I'm going to be exhausted afterwards. Right. So, but you mentioned something I think that's really valuable, which is the mentality of it. Did you feel like they were in alignment when you were doing it? Was it an escape?
I think it was running away. I think if I look back to what I do now and how I do it now versus how I operated beforehand, it's easy to say that I was more entrepreneurial than I understood, innately from my dad, right? So when I was in these corporate roles in private equity, I wasn't really being myself, right? Partly because I didn't like having a boss, but I'd have to conform. So the running, to some extent, was an escape of all that. It definitely was a running away from the environment that I'd put myself in. That was one part of it. The second part of it was, I honestly, and I still believe this, that a strong mind exists within a strong body. And I learned that from the personal training stuff that I did many, many years ago. And so I going out and doing those marathons every Sunday or running in a race, I felt that when I went into the boardroom with these guys, particularly the ones that didn't look overly healthy, might be overweight or whatever else, they might be worth a lot of money, but I had an edge in those negotiations. I'd be like, you can't do what I can do. You can't, right? Physically, and maybe that's a bit alpha, but that environment is like that. So you're not going to beat me, right? So I was training my mind to be able to perform.
Interesting.
But I was also running away from the environment. So there was a confliction, I think, as I look back now and reflect on it.
As you reflect on it, but in the moment, it sounds like all you heard was, yeah, I'm a fucking badass and I'm going to crush you here right now.
It was more that.
And I can prove it because I ran 100 miles last weekend. Did you do that?
So it's funny that a couple of the guys, they tease me. They call me Bobby Axelbrad. My last name is Bradley, right? From Bobby Axelrod. And from the show Billions for everyone watching. And my environment wasn't that dissimilar. I got to be honest. That's the sort of stuff that was going on. Everything was, gung-ho, alpha, bravado sort of stuff. Money first, people second, relationships not that important. So it was a competition, maybe like some sort of gladiatorial battle in many cases. Fun at the time. I mean, I got to say, and people was like, I don't want people to think, I've suddenly had this like awakening. I'm a different person. Because I'm not, right? There are elements that I've let go of, but there are elements of that world that have served me very, very well in what I do now. I don't want to lose that. And I can turn that on and be that guy again if I need to be. I just have more understanding and appreciation for where that's effective versus where it wasn't beforehand.
I love it. Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah.
It's intense. Well, and I fundamentally believe this notion of how you do one thing is how you do everything.
Yeah.
And so if you create a pattern in your life, that's going to repeat itself in other areas. And so if I find a pattern that's not good it's most common for me in hiring or partnerships.
Yep.
When I find a pattern that I identify as bad, that I think is really not okay, I stay away because I'm afraid that it's going to ripple into the thing. Even if it doesn't immediately interact with me in the business relationship, I'm afraid that it's going to ripple in later because I can see this pattern running.
That's a really interesting distinction, I think, because I believe that as well. How you do everything is how you do anything is how you do everything. And there is a point where I think there are different dimensions to it though. So, there are times or seasons, as I like to call them, where something has to be focused on in a certain way. You might even be out of balance for a season because that's what the season calls for, right? And the same way, there are certain, I suppose, modalities of how you show up, which are going to be more effective. I think I ground myself in a certain set of values, which are who I am, but it doesn't mean I can't turn the dial up on any one of those at any one point in time, if it's going to get the result, the outcome that's aligned with what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. I think as I get older and at least pretend to be more mature,
That's me too.
I am more aware of that. I allow that to be the case more in my assessment, and simultaneously acknowledge that it's a very small portion of the population that actually does have full control and isn't just driven by their patterns and habits. So you say, yes, you know that you can dial something up or down, but I think many people don't have that self-awareness and don't have the capacity internally to fight emotion or fight pattern to recreate in order to get to the outcome that they want.
Yeah, and there's a lot of courage that needs to come into that as well. I mean, the UPW events I mentioned with Tony Robbins was my first understanding of a different way of operating, right? So, you know, that whole overused the Matrix 2 pills thing, right? You know, you live in one bubble and then you see the world very differently. You can't go back. Right, that was my experience over 4 days. And some people judge the stuff that Tony does as being, you know, lots of rah and all that, and there is theatre to it, right? You know?
Definitely.
But I ended up signing up at that event to every single one of his programs. So the same year, I ended up going to Date with Destiny, which was amazing, and then all the other things that he does, to be in that environment just to kind of probe a little bit more. And once I had some different tools that I'd learned that I had never heard of before, even appreciated, I've just consistently used those tools. So to your point, once you understand that there are different things that you can do to control your emotional state, and you practice that and play around with it and understand the different, I suppose, parameters for yourself, then you feel more confident to be able to do the things, I think. Certainly, so I wouldn't have been able to do what I'm doing now had I not gone through that Tony Robbins experience.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
Because I would have been stuck in the bubble and I would have been too scared to try and work out what life was like outside of that.
Yep.
Too comfortable in that way.
Well, my path is similar from a Tony perspective. I actually found out about him when I was 20 in sales.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, and listened to his CDs in my car when I was out selling. Went through Personal Power when I was 20. But then didn't do anything until I was probably 30, early 30s.
Yep.
And went to a UPW and then cascade.
Click.
All of the Tony Robbins stuff for the next year and a half, probably.
Yep.
And one of the things that I also tend to believe is that it's not just, it's certainly the gaining this new lexicon, this new set of tools that helps you navigate things in a different way. But it's also the frequency of exposure to it, right? So you have all of these different reference points that you've accumulated over time. And if you only have one, right, if you go to one Tony event, then you have one reference point. And if you do it over and over and over for a year, you're going to have a ton.
Yeah.
Right. And then you have all this stuff that you can pull from. And I think endurance is the same way.
Yeah.
So if you do one run, one marathon, okay. But if you do, how many have you done?
67.
And how many ultras?
24.
Yeah. You do that. Your mind goes to a different place when you encounter a challenge, try to solve a problem.
Yeah. And I the way I think about it, which you just spurned the thought of, is it becomes part of your identity because you build it in, you hardwire it, right? So I'm similar to you. I did read Tony's books when I was in my 20s, and I didn't understand any of them. And of course, you know, when he says put the book down and do the work in the book, I never did any of that stuff. But when you're stuck in a room with 10,000 other people for 4 days, and I was there by myself, didn't take anyone with me, I was just by myself, then you start to understand it and it becomes more hardwired. And that's the only time when I actually started to put into practice the things that he suggested. And then, interestingly, just for people listening, I did everything prescriptively. And if I look what I do now, I don't do hardly any of the stuff in the same way I did when I started. I've chosen the things that work for me, and I'm much more understanding of that. And I think with the running and fitness, I have been exercising at a certain level since I was young, different types of athletics and all sorts. And I often say that that's my identity now. It will never not be my identity. So when I was, put on all that weight in that sort of 12-month period, that was massively out of my identity, which was another shift that forced me to take the action that I took. And I think it was also the shift that caused this, because my mind was spinning so much, it manifested physically with the teeth thing, because I was so out of congruence with my expectation of who I wanted to be. Deep stuff for everyone. But I say a lot on my show that you can't scale a business past the level of your identity. You could argue you can't scale your life past that. But so many business owners and founders that I get the privilege to work with, often it's mindset, it's ability to think differently and bigger. That's the first bridge before they can go and do these exits and all the other crazy technical stuff that I help them with.
Yeah. Well, I think that that's precisely why entrepreneurs gravitate towards high-performing athletes, both endurance and otherwise.
That's right.
But you look at, the flavor of the last few years is David Goggins in the endurance.
Love that book.
Right. And all entrepreneurs do, because the intensity and mindset required to do that has tremendous parallels.
Yes.
In business life.
Yeah. 100%. And that's why I think there is a certain degree of asking more of yourself, right? You've got to put yourself into a position of being uncomfortable, I think, often to find whatever that next level is. And again, that's a parallel back to the running. When I run these days and the events that I do these days, they're less extreme, partly because my body doesn't allow it to be quite as extreme with knees and things like that. But it's more relaxed and focused. And I use it as something that connects me with what I used to do beforehand, but I don't feel the need anymore to push myself to absolute extreme.
Yeah.
Whether that changes in the future, I'm starting to think I need to have a new challenge now. I'm not quite sure what that's going to be, but it's a different way of thinking about it than what it was previously.
We're living in a very similar space from that perspective.
Good.
I broke a bone in my foot. I did rim to rim to rim in the Grand Canyon.
Okay, I know that.
One side to the other, down back to the beginning.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was an awesome experience. And it's a 45-mile run. And about 14 miles in, I rolled my left ankle into a rock and broke a bone in my left foot. And, you're at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. So what do? You keep running. But the recovery period after that was a couple months.
Yeah.
And then through the year, I just did a ton of travel, and I kind of fell out of, once your baseline disappears, getting back up to a solid baseline for endurance stuff takes a while.
It does. And it's painful as well.
And it's kind of annoying.
I was doing stuff like, there's a thing called Phil Maffetone. He's got this thing called the Maffetone method, which is Greg Welch, the famous Ironman, used to do this, where you have to build up your aerobic capacity at the low end of your heart rate. And then you effectively get faster at the low end of your heart rate. So when you're doing these long events, you're effectively burning fat as opposed to have to relying on glycogen and sugar. But of course, if you lose your base, right, and let's say it's 135 beats per minute is where you need to hold for a couple of hours to be able to start to build that capacity. You might be walking or running up a hill, and all of a sudden your heart rate goes up, and then you've got to walk the hill. And I remember I spent years getting to a point where I could run these ultras without having hardly any food. Like I was just living off, fat stores.
Oh my God.
I know it's slightly off topic, but now when I get back into it, I'm trying to do the same thing again, thinking, God, do I really want to spend 2 years building back to that?
Right.
The answer right now is no. The answer is I just want to compete, have fun, not necessarily go as hardcore. I enjoy trail running more than anything else. I want to be out there in the nature, and we'll see. But there's something up there that's going, you can do a bit more now. You're turning 50 in 2 years. Maybe go back and do that 100-mile again in Vermont 10 years later.
Well, call me. And call me. And I want to talk about the nutrition side of it, because while our entrepreneur friends probably couldn't give less fucks about that.
Yeah, I'm sure they love that bit.
I want to talk about it a lot because, the condition of your body, like the conditioning of your body to get you to an endurance event, your mind, and then fuel.
Yes.
Are the three major elements of doing endurance.
That's exactly right.
And the food management and the fuel is such a big deal. It's like cash flow in a business, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't just ignore it.
Well, and it's like it has a massive impact on your performance. The other thing I'll say, because I think it's relevant to business too, is, I hired the best coach I could afford at the time, and this was a guy based out of Australia, and he was coaching me. He'd run and won lots of ultra marathons. And so
winning ultra marathons is a whole nother world, right?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't winning, but I was
placing.
Not quite top 10.
That's impressive, man. If you're actually competing in those things, it's a totally different mindset.
Yeah,
I'm just going to get done with it.
If I was in the top 20 of a race with say 400-500 people, that would be good, right?
That's a big deal.
And I had a few of those. More often than not, I'd certainly be in the top 5%, of a race, 5-10%. So I was comfortable with that as well. But so that's why I was investing in the performance, because then it wasn't just about the experience. Like the psychology I said at the boardroom, I had to win these things. Or, I wasn't physically as gifted as others, but to go in these races and, often I'd be like in the bottom 100, the top 100. And then halfway through the race, I'd work my way up to be in the top 20 or 30, and I'd be running through people, because I'd learned how to do that. But I had to get the coaching for that. I had to get the mentorship, the whole stuff that, again, is applicable to business as much as anything else.
Also, best feeling ever to be in a race and then just start passing people.
Oh my God. Well, there's some stories I can tell you. When I said beforehand, there's a thing going on back here about I don't know if I can just go and do stuff. I need to be able to go and compete at a certain level. It might be in an age group or something like that, just so I have something going on. But we'll see.
Well, okay, so back to, I know we're coming close to the end of time here, so let's go back to today.
Yeah.
And talk about, so you spent all this time doing acquisitions and then helping people exit.
Yep.
And today you're specifically spending a lot of time talking to founders, and it's typically 8-figure and up founders,
right,
about how to position for exit and what to look for exit. Is that all accurate so far?
Yeah, very much so. I call myself these days an exit strategist more than anything else, I suppose. Exit coach, maybe if you go down that route. But I don't sell the company. I don't broker the company. I do everything in the lead up to that, which can be quite a long runway. So quite often I'll say the best time for me to come into a company is about 36 months before you want to put it on the market, if we even need to do that, right? Because quite often the stuff that I help with is getting the business so attractive and so ready, and that means internally and externally. So we're having conversations in the market, but we're not putting the business for sale. I'll elaborate on that in a second. So that an exit can happen before you have to go out there and pay a very expensive investment banker or corporate finance person. So for people who don't understand that, when you sell a company, what most people think happens is, I want to sell my company today, right? And I'm going to go now speak to an investment banker or a broker. And of course, they just want to sell the company, and they take big fees. I mean, if you're selling a company for 8 or 9 figures, those fees can be at minimum 1%, but all the way up to sort of 5 to 7%. So they're almost like getting an equity stake for because we talked about marathons, the last 100 meters of the marathon, right? The entrepreneur's built this business, then the investment banker comes in.
Let me help you run across the finish line.
Yeah, and I'll take, more equity than probably half of your staff have got.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the model. So what I do is I'll go in, usually around 3 years beforehand. And the first thing we do is we look at the value of the business today. So we do a valuation on it. We look at the number that the team or the founder wants to exit for. So my belief is, wherever your starting point is, you can get to that number. It's what you do to build value in the business in order to do that. And then we have the delta. So we know that the business is worth this now. We know that the founder wants to take this amount of money out. So we know financially how we need to gear the business, and we can work back from that. How do we scale it? Well, we get really good at marketing, acquisitions, so marketing and sales. And then we look at strategic partnerships, and we look at acquisitions to build up the revenue, customer base, and all of those sort of things. And then the second lens we look at, which is super important, is we assess, I mentioned before, readiness, which is effectively 4 things. It's the quality of the people and the structure that you have in the business. We call that human capital. It's the processes, the systems, any technology that's driving automation and efficiency. We call that structural capital. We look at the customer base, how much recurring or subscription revenue is coming in, long-term contracts, making sure there isn't over-reliance on too fewer customers, and that's called customer capital. And then the last thing we look at is the culture, the brands. Sometimes a business can have value even if the financials are poor because the brand is so strong. And we call that social capital, and we assess the whole thing. And so over the course of that sort of 36 months, broken down into sort of 90-day increments, we work on various things in the business to keep building the value. And the way I look at it is if a private equity firm or someone came in and they had to kick the tires on the business, you've done everything in advance so that it is a stunningly beautifully built thing at the point when you decide to put it on the market. And I'll finish by saying what that does, and this is the big thing, is a business is valued either on its profit or its revenue, depending on whether it's more tech-enabled and other dynamics in the market. But the multiple, so that's the number that profit or revenue is multiplied by to get to the enterprise value, which is the number you sell your company for, that is a range. It's not an absolute. And the range is dictated by the market. You can't control it. But what you can control is at what point you sit on the range. So just to use some basic sums, let's say it's a small business that's doing 5 million profit and the market range is 5 and 10. Okay, so there's
meaning 5 to 10x.
Yes, exactly. So if you've got a company that isn't that transferable, some of those things I mentioned aren't built effectively. If you can sell it at all, because sometimes businesses that are good financially can't be sold for lots of different reasons, you might sell that for 5 times 5, which is 25 million. Okay. That might be great. You might say, that's the number. I want 20 million. That's my number. But if you spend a bit of time working on those things I mentioned and you're kind of best in class versus the market, you might sell it 10 times. Okay. So 5 times 10 is 50. So by investing a bit of time just getting the business ready, the delta that you can take from that is 25 million. Right? So I often say, is there a better use of your time or money or whatever in the space of a few months to make that life-changing result? And most entrepreneurs, business owners don't understand that, but they go, wow, yeah, absolutely. And then the business is going to sell. It's going to sell for the highest multiple and everyone's happy. That's what I do. Simple as that.
Yeah, right. It sounds easy. So you mentioned two things a couple times, which were strategy and marketing. And what seemed like a synonym to strategy was acquisitions.
Yes.
Is that always part of the play for you when you're looking at, hey, how do you get to exit? Are you always looking at who can you buy to plug a hole, to add value, to make the company stronger?
I'm always looking, so the actual, I created this equation, if you want to call it that, which is organic growth plus strategic growth will drive exponential growth. Okay. And a little bit of that is influenced by some time I spent with Jay Abraham on the exponential side. But organic growth, as far as I'm concerned, is marketing and sales. Strategic growth is acquisitions and partnerships. Now, everyone has to have really dialed in organic growth. If you're not getting decent organic growth from great marketing and sales, then you're not going to have the financials anyway. Not every business has to acquire other businesses, but they certainly have to look at strategic partnerships. And one of the best ways, I mentioned beforehand, how do you sell a business without going through investment banking? You build really strong strategic partnerships up the chain with people who have the capacity and the cash to buy you. And I've negotiated so many of these deals where, you know, a partnership is then turned into an acquisition conversation. And we knew that was going to be the case. There's a company I'm helping at the moment, which we think is going to go for about, well, positioned for about $180 million. And we're selling that to a private equity-backed business up the chain. And we started that conversation as a partnership 6 months before it's now turned into an acquisition conversation. But that was all orchestrated. So you don't have to do acquisitions, but if it feels right and the foundations in the business are dialed in and you're on that pathway and you want to buy your suppliers or customers or even buy some of their assets, like a customer list or whatever, my advice is you've got to add that, you know, to at least to the strategic thinking, because it could increase that multiple and that exit for you by millions just by making a couple of almost last minute moves.
That's great. Well, I want to keep talking about this because I'm selfish and I want to learn more about it. I also know that we have to wrap. So for people to find out more about you, where do they go?
Yeah, so my podcast is now called Scale Up with Nick Bradley. So it used to be called Scale Up Your Business, but you can find that on iTunes and Spotify and all of that. If they want to learn more about me and my story, my website is scaleupwithnickbradley.com. And then the consultancy that I run is highvalueexit.com. So you can check those websites out. Heaps of different resources there and some of the stuff I've spoken about. And the one thing I will say, because I know there are probably different levels of entrepreneurs listening to this, I started the podcast talking to everyone about the playbook. So if you go back, there's like 300 episodes there. Those first few ones, I've got everything, like how to be a great CEO, the difference between direct response and brand marketing, how to build great teams. And I often say to people, if you want to kind of just learn how to fix something in your business, there's probably an episode that I've done there to be able to help.
I love that. Well, certainly this audience will get a ton of value out of that. So great place. Mr. Bradley, love spending time with you, man.
Mate, it's been awesome. Great to connect to you, Brad. I appreciate you. Appreciate what you're doing. And yeah, great to build a friendship and a collaboration with you.
Love it. Till next time.
Thank you.